Elise relentlessly pursued Alpha Landon, only to switch her affections to beta Elijah after being rejected. Elijah remains wary of her advances, staying true to the mate he's destined to find, despite the long wait. Welcome to the Alpha's Love channel. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Chapter 13, Reunion. A few days later. I hope you liked the books I sent you, Beta Elijah. The beta in question closed his eyes and sighed as Elise approached him with a dazzling smile. Up until a few weeks ago, he'd been in charge of fending the young Omega away from Alpha Landon, but now who was going to fend her away from him? He was glad that Landon and Olwen had found another chance at romance in each other, as slow as they were taking things, but now that the Alpha was off limits, it appeared that Elise had made him her next unwilling target. Elijah turned towards her and gave her a simple, polite smile, moving out of the way when she tried to brush his arm. Admittedly, Elise was a rather beautiful lady. When they'd been teenagers, he'd nursed a crush on her for a brief time, but he refused to act on it due to the future mate bonds they would have. "Your mate will be the moon goddess's gift to you," his father had told him, ruffling his hair with a smile. "Be patient, son. Once you find your mate, suddenly no one else in your life will matter as much anymore. And you'll do everything in your power to give them the world." Back then, his hormonal 15-year-old self prayed desperately to the moon goddess to make Elise his mate once they were of age. But that want faded months later, after Elijah realized that Elise seemed to have her eye on the future Alpha. Once his 18th birthday had passed and he didn't find his mate within the Moon River pack, he was indifferent to the realization that Elise was not fated to him. "I appreciate the thought, Elise, but I'm sure you know as well as anyone else in the Moon River pack that I am waiting on my fated mate. Just as much as you should be waiting for yours," he stated to her matter-of-factly. Now, he could safely say he was relieved that Elise Ainsworth was not his mate. From what he'd seen of her in recent years, shamelessly pursuing Landon after he was rejected and then just switching to Elijah, after treating him like chopped liver for almost a decade, the Omega didn't have any respect for the mate bond. Considering how quickly she'd appeared to have moved on from her infatuation with the Alpha, she hadn't had any genuine feelings for him either. "But Beta Elijah," he corrected her swiftly. He'd allowed her to call him Eli back in their teenage days, but now her clearly intentional use of that nickname made him cringe. "Seriously, why did you let her call you that?" Ellis snorted in his mind. "I understand your devotion to your mate, but it's been years and you haven't found them," Elise pointed out softly. "Just as I haven't found mine. What if your mate rejects you the way Alpha Landon's did?" The thought of his mate rejecting him made Elijah's heart wrench, as Ellis rose and snarled defensively. "Our mate is still out there. They can't reject us." Elijah quickly recovered and turned to properly face Elise. It was true his faith in the moon goddess had been shaken after witnessing the pain it caused his best friend, but he wasn't going to be the one to betray his fated even before they'd shown up. "I won't be sure until I meet them. Now please, do something more useful. I've sent the books back to your home, so maybe you should read them instead. Now if you excuse me, Elise, I'm busy." He then averted his gaze from her and walked quickly away. Elise frowned, slowing to a stop as Beta Elijah strode out of sight. Growing up as an Omega, she'd been coddled and pampered by her parents, and she hadn't had any issues bending people to her will just by using her innocent wide eyes and soft, gentle voice. So what was it about the Alpha and Beta of the Moon River pack that they weren't at all fazed by her attempts? When she began to mature, her parents were certain that a beautiful Omega like her would become mates with the future Alpha. She may not have been the strongest or smartest she-wolf in the Moon River pack, but she didn't need to be. All she needed to do was get with Landon and bear his pups. Landon didn't show the slightest interest in her when they were friends in high school, and when his 18th birthday passed and he found Rianne, her parents' hopes for her withered away. But then Rianne bolted after 2 months, rejecting Landon in the process. Convinced she would become Landon's chosen mate, she'd become more bold in pursuing him, sending him gifts and dropping by his office unannounced. Perhaps after being around her long enough, he would be swayed, except again, he didn't. The moment Olwen Adams entered his office, Elise saw the way Landon's eyes lit up. She had lost to another Omega. And not any regular Omega. Word was that Olwen had almost become the Lunar back in the Silver Arrow pack, but was practically kicked out after her mate had an affair. Elise wanted to feel sorry for her, but all she could experience was shame and humiliation that Landon hadn't looked at her like that when they'd known each other for years, while Olwen had barely been here in comparison. So this was her way of salvaging her pride. If she couldn't become the Alpha's mate, she would become the Beta's instead. It might have been easier, she tried to convince herself. She knew that Beta Elijah had once liked her, and surely she could unearth those feelings again. So even though it had already been a few days since she'd started her pursuit of the Beta, and he hadn't budged, it was too soon to give up. What would our mate think of you? Ember huffed quietly in her head. Elise sighed, turning and heading back to her cottage where she was bound to get another motivational speech from her father about being rebuffed. Nothing. Maybe we won't ever find our mate. Maybe they'll reject me. You don't know that. I do. I've been chasing after Landon for so long, everyone in the pack knows that. I will make Elijah mine. It won't be fair to you or the Beta's mate. Ember growled. She was more of a mother figure to Elise than her own was, and regretted not surfacing sooner, so she wouldn't have to be privy to all the stupid decisions her human was making. Just don't, okay? Elise blocked out her wolf's protests as she stepped through her door. Punch. Kick. Punch. Spin. Punch. Duck. Shift. Bite. There was no room for a breather as Opal shifted back into Olwen and aimed a flying kick at the dummy, sending it tumbling back onto the ground. She then quickly shifted again and pounced onto the dummy, practicing her aim for the opponent's throat. This was not one of Delta Cassidy's sessions. In fact, Olwen was sure she'd seen her having a picnic with Jackson on her way to the training center. Olwen shifted herself back into her human form and redressed herself quickly before she headed over to dry her sweat with a towel and drink some water. Shifting so quickly back and forth in a short time had taken a bit more out of her than she would have liked. But she would have to use this to accustom herself to both human and wolf fighting. It also provided some satisfaction and catharsis for her to picture the dummy as either Kylie or Aaron. What they'd done to her was unforgivable, and while she was no longer hurting from it, it didn't mean she would let it go. At this thought, Olwen got up and returned the dummy to its original place, getting into her stance and preparing to attack it once again. Still hard at work, I see. Olwen stopped and turned towards the direction of the voice, unable to stop her heart from fluttering as she saw the Alpha entering the gym. Alpha. She bowed her head to him. How long have you been here? Landon asked, glancing at the dummy and at her towel and water bottle by the side. A few hours. Olwen shrugged, glancing up at the clock. Well, if you're not tired, I could use a sparring partner. Landon set down his own towel and water bottle before donning a pair of boxing gloves and headgear like those that Olwen was wearing. She looked at him, feeling anticipation and nerves settle in her stomach. Me? I'm sure any strength I have doesn't measure up to yours. I've been keeping tabs on your training progress, and I beg to differ. Landon assured her with a challenging glint in his eyes. The pair began to circle each other. Besides, maybe you could learn a thing or two from me. Olwen smirked at him. You're not going to go easy on me just because I'm a female, or an Omega, are you? No, but I might have to go easy on you because you're not as experienced in fighting as I am. Landon aimed for a punch, but allowed Olwen to block it with ease. I don't want the latest addition to our pack to be hospitalized because of me. Olwen laughed, going in for her own shot, but having it quickly blocked by the alpha as well. You sure you're not giving yourself too much credit? You sure you want that to be your last words? Landon smirked, going in for another jab. Olwen dodged, but felt the wind as his fist just barely missed her face. She pressed her lips together, not willing to eat her words just yet as she ducked another attack from the alpha, and drew from some of Opal's strength to knock the man over. Landon let out a grunt of astonishment as his back hit the mat. Huh? Not bad, Olwen. Olwen attempted a series of punches aimed at his face, but the alpha blocked them once again by using his fists. She had the high ground for a brief moment before Landon rolled them over and pinned her onto the mat instead. But if you ever dream of defeating me, you'll have to try harder, he said with a triumphant smirk. Unwilling to admit her loss, Olwen tried everything in her power to get Landon off her, but to no avail. At the back of her mind, she knew she could try to escape his grasp by shifting, but she didn't exactly trust her wolf to restrain herself around the Moon River Pack Alpha. The most she could do was block off any attempts towards her face, and kick her legs in a futile attempt at struggling despite the laughter that was threatening to spill from her lips. The moment Landon pushed apart her hands and their eyes met, the amusement of the moment faded, and for a moment so did the world around them. Olwen's heart picked up as she gazed into Landon's face. His hair was covered with an amount of sweat, his blue orbs staring right back at her. She was suddenly waking up in the forest after a long period of rain, inhaling that refreshing scent. Alpha Landon's scent. Olwen bit her lip, mentally struggling with Opal for a brief moment, as she attempted to rise to the surface. She knew her eyes had probably changed and was prepared to apologize to the alpha when she saw the blue change into yellow and then blue again. Lark? Landon was catching his breath, his chest rising and falling. Other than their inhaling and exhaling, they didn't speak for a long time. And then he broke the silence. You smell like lavender and honey. He spoke simply, his voice becoming thick and his expression intense. Olwen blinked, and let out a soft laugh to try and relieve the tension that was suddenly present. Ah yes. I know that. Olwen. Nevertheless, she couldn't help the shiver that went up her spine at the way her name rolled off Landon's tongue. Opal whined in the back of her mind. You smell like lavender and honey, and it's driving me crazy. Landon finished. Olwen swallowed, her heart thumping loudly. She wanted to say that Landon's scent had the same effect on her, but for some reason the words couldn't rise out from her throat. And then he began to lean his head down, slowly inching closer to hers. Olwen didn't move an inch as the alpha moved his face nearer and nearer, until she could feel his breath on her lips. Landon stopped there, so close yet so far. She could see the apprehension in his eyes, he was giving her an out if she didn't want this. So Olwen leaned her head up slightly and pressed her lips against his. Perhaps she could have intended it as a quick peck of affection, but the moment their lips touched it was as if all common sense was tossed out the window. Landon emitted a low, oddly possessive growl and became more emboldened, a hand sliding into her brown locks to support her head as they kissed. Even more perplexing was that Olwen didn't mind nor resist, moving her lips back against his with enthusiasm, as her arms wrapped around his shoulders and pulled him close. Landon groaned at this and tilted his head, gently asking for permission to deepen the kiss, which Olwen swiftly gave. Olwen was on fire, overwhelmed by how invigorating it felt to finally make out with Landon Cartwright. It felt passionate, desperate and filled with emotions that the pair of them had been holding back from one another. It was the kind of kiss Olwen would have expected if one of them was about to vanish right in front of the other's eyes. One of Olwen's hands left Landon's shoulder to run through his hair, not minding the sweat, as she pulled his head as close as possible to hers. Alpha Landon, Olwen. Gamma Josh's voice came through the mind link, startling them both and making them break the kiss with flushed and embarrassed faces. You'd better come to the east border when you're ready. I think the former beater to be of the Silver Arrow Pack, and her family have just arrived. Olwen saw Landon's eyes glaze over as he mind-linked with Josh before he got off her, taking off his gloves and headgear. I just told the Gamma we'd be there in 20 minutes. You should probably shower and change into something more presentable before we go and meet your old friend. Still in a daze and caught off guard, Olwen managed a nod, getting up from the mat and going to take off her own training gear. Okay. Olwen didn't know whether she was more excited that Stella had arrived at the Moon River Pack, or more dismayed that her arrival had disrupted the moment between her and Alpha Landon. After a quick shower and changing into a buttoned-up blouse and light brown pants, Olwen hopped on her bike and cycled in the direction of the east borders. As the area came into view, she saw that Alpha Landon and Gamma Josh were already there. A car that Olwen recognized as the Andersons was parked nicely just next to a large pine tree, and three much more familiar figures were out and talking to Alpha Landon. Ah! Here she is, Landon said as Olwen parked her bike against another tree before walking towards them. You can catch up with her first, my beta is preparing the necessary documents to process your arrival. As she drew nearer, the first person she zeroed in on was the black-haired woman with dark brown eyes, her own expression morphing into shock and disbelief as her friend stopped a distance from her. Olwen, briefly afraid that the she-wolf would be upset at her for not telling her she was in the Moon River Pack, Olwen dipped her head. Hello again, Stella. Barely another moment went by before a sob escaped Stella's lips and she pulled Olwen into a tight hug. You're okay? I was so scared that I couldn't reach you. I thought something might have happened to you. Finally letting the emotions overcome her, Olwen relaxed into the hug and gently rubbed her friend's back. I'm all right, Stella. I survived as a rogue for 3 months before Alpha Landon inducted me in the Moon River Pack. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. No, I get it. You went through a lot, and I'm sure you didn't want to think about what you went through back in the Silver Arrow Pack. Stella assured her, gently releasing her and stepping back with a smile. I'm just glad you're well. Olwen. Sylvie hurried over to Olwen and embraced her next, shedding happy tears. We're relieved you're safe, honey. We missed you so much. Life in the Silver Arrow Pack just wasn't the same without you. Aaron shouldn't have. I've come to terms with it. Olwen interrupted softly, nodding at the closest person she had to a mother figure. She then turned to Kale, who was getting up from the grass beneath the pine tree. So I heard from Stella's message that you hacked into Aaron's email. She began with a grin. Kale couldn't help the smile that came onto his face at her words, and his chest puffed slightly with pride. Yeah. I did. Olwen chuckled and hugged him as well. You are full of surprises, you know that. I know. Kale responded, briefly hugging back before stepping away. Alpha Landon strode over shortly after, and the three all bowed their heads to him in respect. Beta Elijah has finished the necessary preparations, and is on his way here. Stella Anderson, can you all swear on your life that what you told me earlier is the truth? Stella bowed again and nodded. Yes, after my brother leaked the truth to the rest of the Silver Arrow Pack under my instruction, he was attacked by Alpha Bradley. Multiple wolves, including myself and my parents, had to intervene and stop him from doing any further hurt. After this, the three of us renounced our positions as members of the Silver Arrow Pack and left. Her voice was quiet, but firm as she looked back up at the Alpha. Landon nodded and gestured for her to rise. Once my beta gets here, we'll discuss further terms in my office. He glanced at Olwen, briefly mind-linking her. I can see why she was going to be your beta. Anyways, we have so much to discuss. Stella said to Olwen. But I did try to bring most of your stuff over from the Silver Arrow Pack. Starting with this. She trudged over to the car, retrieving a plant from the boot. Olwen's eyes widened as she recognized the bromeliad she'd cared for in her office when she'd still been training as Luna. It's still flourishing, thank goodness. She accepted the potted plant from Stella like the precious thing it was. Yeah, Kylie wanted it gone since Aaron bought it for you. She even slapped Jessie over it. Olwen frowned. Kylie did what? Stella sighed. It's a long story. I'll tell you in a bit. The she-wolf then stopped short as she seemed to sense something. Wait, what's that? Miss and Mr. Anderson, Alpha Landon drew everyone's attention. This is my second-in-command, Beta Elijah Atwood. The man with ashen brown curls and hazel eyes was approaching them, and he first bowed to Landon. Alpha. Everything is ready for you in your office. Good. He gestured to the newcomers in front of him, as he introduced each of them in the order in which they stood. Elijah, these are Olwen's associates. This is Mrs. Sylvie Anderson, the wife of the Beta of the Silver Arrow Pack, her younger son, Mr. Cale Anderson, and her daughter, Miss Stella Anders. Landon happened to glance back towards his friend, his voice trailing off, as he saw the expression on Elijah's face. The next moment stunned everyone present. With his eyes rapidly shifting between hazel and green, Elijah took several purposeful strides across the forest clearing and pulled an equally shocked Stella into his arms. Mate. Chapter 14 Friendship. The administration process that took place in Landon's office turned out to be a bit more complicated than previously thought. To be more specific, processing the papers for Sylvie and Cale were fine, but Stella had to write down her particulars whilst being seated in his Beta's lap. Beta Elijah had not left Stella's side since he'd laid eyes on her at the east borders. Even now, as she was writing down details on the form, the man had his arms wrapped around her waist, his facial expression that of a human in a fight with his wolf, trying to prevent himself from openly burying his nose in Stella's neck and inhaling her scent. Stella wasn't exactly unfazed either, her cheeks tinted a rosy pink, as she tried her best to concentrate on penning her signature on the paper despite the way her hand shook. Standing aside and waiting for the administration process to be completed, Olwen had never seen her friend this flustered before, and even she herself was still coming to terms with how Beta Elijah and Stella had turned out to be fated. Sylvie and Cale waited beside her, their own expressions betraying their amusement. The awkward silence in the room dragged on, with only the clicking of computer keys and the distant rumbling of the air conditioner being heard before Alpha Landon spoke. Allow me and my Beta to accompany you three to your tentative accommodations for the week. Everyone was startled by the low growling that was coming from Elijah, including Stella. Landon sighed and leveled his gaze rather sternly at him. This is protocol for any wolves wishing to join the Moon River Pack, even if they are mates with any of the members. This was enough for Elijah to reluctantly fall silent and dip his head. Of course, Alpha. Apologies. He muttered. Stella twisted her head around to look up at him, and immediately the Beta softened, reaching out one hand to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The she-wolf turned even redder, and looked back down at the interesting nothingness on Alpha Landon's desk. My sister has found her mate. Cale repeated. I am going to have a brother-in-law. That is going to take some getting used to. Olwen and him were seated in the dining room of the temporary home, the very same which Olwen had stayed in when she first came to the Moon River Pack. Sylvie was already setting up the fridge and carrying out ingredients for dinner, and Olwen and Cale were talking while discreetly watching Elijah and Stella interact at the front porch of the house. Elijah was gently clasping her hands and saying something, his face earnest and his hazel eyes focused on her, as if she was all his life depended upon now. They couldn't see Stella's expression, but she appeared to be nodding as she listened to what her mate was saying. The Beta then gently lifted her hands to his lips before stepping away and heading off. Stella turned and headed back into the house, her face still beet red and incredibly disoriented. You good, sis? Cale asked with a teasing smirk, as his sibling drew back a chair and sat down at the dining table next to them. His name is Elijah Atwood. Stella spoke quietly, her eyes staring past both her brother and friend. My mate. Her eyes flashed indigo, as she jerked her head in the direction in which the beater had gone before she blinked and snapped herself out of it. Sorry guys, everything that happened today is just a lot to take in, she said, scratching the back of her neck. We're staying in a new pack, and the pack's beater is my fated. No worries. Cale chuckled. Finding your mate is a lot to take in. He paused as his phone chimed. Oh, excuse me. I need to take this. Carl got up and went off into what had been designated as his room, leaving Olwen and Stella outside as Sylvie hummed in the kitchen, audibly turning on the stove and whisking something, probably eggs. Olwen noticed the conflicted look in Stella's gaze. Are you okay? Yeah, it's just. Stella leaned forward, her voice lowering with some amount of embarrassment. I've never really thought about what it would be like to find my mate. After my 18th birthday passed and I knew my mate wasn't in the Silver Arrow pack, I kind of just chose not to think about it. My dad was training me to become his replacement once I was of age, so I just devoted all my thoughts to that. She shrugged and looked down nervously. I can discuss pack matters and give speeches and presentations just fine, but I still can't talk to guys, let alone my mate. Sometimes, Olwen forgot that Stella was far from untouchable and had her own self-doubts as well. Back even before they'd become friends, she'd admired the girl from afar. Stella had been known for being hardworking and diligent even in her teenage years, to the point where she didn't really attend any parties or talk to others outside of studying and training. Only after Olwen had started her lunar training and grown closer to her did Stella admit to her that it wasn't because she didn't want to get to know her pack members, it was because she didn't know how to just talk with others without feeling self-conscious. At this thought, she rubbed her friend's shoulder encouragingly. I'm sure that your mate wouldn't mind that about you. Maybe you two still need time to get to know each other better, but from the way beater Elijah couldn't take his eyes off you since the East borders. I know. Stella reddened again at the thought. He spoke to me outside. He seemed so happy and relieved. He told me how he'd waited years for me, and that he would do his best to be a good mate to me. Her lips pressed together. But what if he's just like this now, because of how much he wanted to meet his fated? Once we start spending some time together, he might be disappointed. She covered her eyes and rested her elbows on the table. He said he's going to come back here tomorrow to take me out on our first date, and I have no idea what to expect. Olwen sighed softly and gently pried her friend's hands away from her face. Give both him and yourself a chance, Stella. Don't think about what could go wrong before you even start. Putting aside all your fears, what do you think of Elijah? Stella paused before looking up at Olwen. Honestly. Based on first impressions. Sure. By the moon goddess, that man is gorgeous. Stella burst out, as if she'd been holding that back for ages. I never thought I had a type, but it would be him. He has such warm eyes, and I didn't know I had a thing for freckles until now. And he told me he loves to visit the library in his spare time. I didn't realize my mate would enjoy reading as much as I do. She paused as her eyes flashed to indigo and then back to dark brown again, and she blushed even more deeply. Sorry, as you can probably tell, Star has been driving me up the wall since we found our mate. It's taken everything in me not to just jump the guy. Although something tells me he probably wouldn't have minded I was watching him. Beater Elijah was in a struggle with his wolf the entire time he was with you. Olwen chuckled, understanding that perfectly. When she'd first found out Aaron was her mate, Opal had reacted the same way. And so had ours, despite the other ideas his human had. Okay, you're right, Olwen. I'll head on our date tomorrow with an open mind and hope for the best. Stella spoke, mustering a smile on her face. For a moment, Orwen was glad that she'd made her friend feel better, but then Stella's smile grew mischievous. But I should be asking you what's going on between you and Alpha Landon. Orwen's eyes widened, as it was her turn for the red water to rush to her cheeks. What do you mean? Stella snickered and folded her arms. It's not too hard to tell there's something. You two were literally sneaking glances at each other the whole afternoon. Orwen knew it was fruitless to lie to Stella Anderson, and her shoulders sagged. He told me when I first joined the Moon River Pack that he was interested in me, but he assured me that it didn't impact my staying if I chose not to give him a chance. Wow. That's very upfront, but at least he was being honest. Stella commented with a shrug. Unlike someone we once knew. Opal snorted. Isn't his fated mate still out there? Orwen shook his head, sadness flashing through her eyes. No. He was rejected a few years before he became Alpha. Stella seemed as if she had more questions regarding that, but instead asked something else. So where do things stand? It's hard to say. Orwen admitted. I was a little wary of him at first, but after getting to know him, and learning of the way he's led the Moon River Pack, I definitely don't think of him as just an acquaintance, let alone just my new Alpha. Well, if this is a comfortable pace you're going at with Alpha Landon, then I'm happy for you, Orwen. Stella gripped her friend's hands with a bright smile. After the bullshit that Aaron put you through, you deserve someone better. Aaron is no longer your mate. Opal agreed, growling at the thought of their former fated. You should be with Landon. Opal brought Orwen's mind back to the way she and Landon had kissed several hours earlier in the training center. Whatever they were at this point, her relationship with the Moon River Pack Alpha had definitely crossed a particular line. But was she ready to go all in? Oh, and speaking of which, Stella's expression darkened. It's about time I fully update you on what happened in the Silver Arrow Pack after you left. By the time Stella had finished, Orwen's grey eyes were wide with disbelief, horror and absolute disgust. You're telling me that Kylie slapped Jessie and Aaron didn't have her punished? Stella snorted and shook her head. She wasn't punished for injuring the warrior who brought you up when it came to her dress for the lunar ceremony. Son of a... Stella had mentioned in her voice message that things had gotten worse in the Silver Arrow Pack, but Orwen hadn't expected Kylie to be a violent hothead along with being a pathological liar. And Alpha Bradley still went ahead with making her Aaron's chosen mate and Luna. The idiot is full of himself and won't accept that his son made a colossal mistake. Stella said simply. It was evident she'd done a lot of thinking after she'd left the pack. He thinks by covering Aaron's tracks that the Silver Arrow Pack will remain strong, but he's actually digging his family into an even deeper hole. And your dad? He chose his side. Bitterness seeped into Stella's voice. Alpha Bradley let him know the truth of how long Aaron and Kylie had been seeing each other, and he didn't tell anyone. It took Kale sending their emails out to the entire pack for that. Orwen's heart broke for her friend. Orwen had looked up to Beta Caden as a mentor, but he had been first and foremost Stella's father. The one who'd doted on her since birth, and saw her as his pride and joy. But the fact that he'd overlooked Kale reminded them both that he was heavily flawed too. Your mother, is she all right? Orwen asked, hearing the sizzling noises coming from the kitchen, as Sylvie tossed around some things in the pan. Stella sighed and glanced briefly in her direction. I hope so. The first few days after we left the pack, she and her wolf were in grief from being apart from her mate. But she pulled through it. She told me and Kale that she didn't regret leaving with us, and that she couldn't stand by him anymore after knowing what he hid. She spoke quietly. Orwen made a mental reminder to do something to show Sylvie her gratitude. You said in the voice message that you were coming to the Moon River Pack to gather support against the new Alpha and Luna of the Silver Arrow Pack. In a way, I am. Stella nodded solemnly. Nothing might have happened yet, But if Kylie can just lose it in front of her own pack members and Aaron keeps supporting her regardless, you can imagine the kind of Luna she'll become or already is. Olwen shuddered at the thought. With the leadership of the strongest pack in the wilds like that, it would only take a matter of time before all hell broke loose. Or maybe, given the example Alpha Bradley had set, things had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. One way or another, the Silver Arrow pack will come into conflict with the Moon River pack. She stated quietly. They don't know that we've joined another pack, and if Kylie really has it out for me like you said, she could come for me and Aaron and his father would back her up. We'll have to be prepared. Stella affirmed, nodding. I don't know at all what happened after I left either, but if our former pack mates know what's good for them, they wouldn't stay in the Silver Arrow pack either. If the pack weakens, the blame will be laid on me and you. I'll be ready. Olwen promised firmly. I've been training under the Delta here, and I think that I stand a fighting chance against most of our former pack. But I'll keep practicing until I know that I can win against them. Stella grinned at her, and Olwen felt that rush of comfort, adrenaline and joy that she still had the support of her best friend and her family. I'll join you. If the need really arises, I'll enjoy making that excuse for a Luna beg for mercy. After a warm and long dinner where Olwen chatted with Stella, Kale and Sylvie, Stella bid her friend good night, and had a nice long shower before climbing into bed. Even as she turned off the lights and pulled the blanket up to her chest, however, she did not at all feel like sleeping. Not with her mind racing at 1,000 miles per minute. She was concerned with how long this respite from her old pack would last, and what the future held in store for the people she held most dear to her. The words from the moon goddess were still floating around in her mind, that Olwen was part of something bigger that would affect all of the Evergreen Wilds packs. But she would only reveal herself to Olwen when the time was right. Regardless, all that paled in comparison to the one face that had branded itself into her head since that afternoon, with no help whatsoever from her wolf. Our mate is so attractive and so sweet to us, Star purred, swishing her tail excitedly. I could sense him and his wolf, they wanted to mark us. So this was what the moon goddess had meant by saying that not only Olwen, but she would also be more than all right once she arrived at the Moon River pack. Star Stella warned, her wolf had been disregarding her, and sending her thoughts about their mate for hours. The black-furred wolf let out a teasing snort. I'm a part of you, Stella Anderson. I feel what you feel. I know you're fantasizing being in bed with your mate as we speak. What? Fuck you're not supposed to see that. Too late. Star purred again at the pleasant images that her human had unintentionally sent her, already itching to just make Stella shift and run to find Elijah. Stella face planted in the sheets with a muffled scream of shame. She'd found it easy to control the impulses of her wolf when she was younger, so why was Star suddenly so hard to handle? Because all those past times were just you thinking of random guys you happened to find attractive at the time. This isn't a random guy. Stella squeezed her eyes shut, inhaling and exhaling to regain her presence and avoid Star from taking over. Even when he wasn't near her, she could still remember his scent, a combination of crackling firewood and cologne that had almost made her knees buckle in front of him. I want to see our mate. Star protested with a whine. And as much as Stella wanted to see him too, she held her wolf back. We'll see him tomorrow. She reminded her, closing her eyes and doing her best to calm Star and get some sleep. For our first date. Chapter 15 Courtship. We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming of Olwen and Landon to bring you more Elijah and Stella. Also, I've been seeing the sudden influx in votes for this story, so thanks a lot everyone. LT3. Stella was never really one to care about fashion. Back in the Silver Arrow pack, Stella's outfits revolved around two things: comfortable and presentable enough. She cycled around the same few pairs of pants and shorts, with either casual or collared shirt depending on the occasion. Only once in a while for special events did Stella put in more effort to dress up at the behest of her parents, despite Olwen's encouragements that she should have done so more often. Little did Olwen know that it would take her friend finding her fated mate to start focusing more on the outfits she wore. "You sure I look okay?" Stella asked for the umpteenth time, fiddling with the outfit she'd settled on with her friend's help. "You're perfectly fine. Elijah mind-linked me and told me you don't need to look too fancy, just dress casual." Casual was a denim, button-up shirt with pale lavender pants. After rummaging through the accessories that Stella had taken with her, Olwen had also thrown her a pair of star-shaped earrings, self-explanatory, and a cream-colored slouchy beanie. "He didn't tell you at all what he was planning for our first date?" Olwen grinned and shook her head. "Nope. Even if he did, I wouldn't tell you." "Oh, come on, Olwen." Her friend playfully nudged her. "Give me something to go by at least." A bit late for that." "He's here." Immediately Stella's eyes went wide, and her head snapped in the direction Olwen was gesturing to. "Beta Elijah. Good morning." Olwen dipped her head to the approaching wolf, and after a split second of staring, Stella followed suit. "Good morning, Beta." It was hard to miss how Elijah acknowledged Olwen with the briefest nod before his gaze was completely devoted to his mate. A warm smile, one of adoration and affection, grew on his face. "Are you ready for our date, Stella?" "I guess so." The young woman managed, her cheeks flushing again. Despite being here to encourage and support her friend, Olwen couldn't help the small chuckle at Stella's face. "Remember to bring my daughter back home by 10, young man." Sylvie called from inside the house, though her tone was perforated with laughter. Stella covered her face, but didn't exactly have the time to respond as Elijah grinned widely and responded in kind to his mate's mother. "Will do, Mrs. Anderson." "Good luck, Stella." Olwen smiled and patted her shoulder before sauntering off to her training session for the day. Usually the Gamma shows around new arrivals to the Moon River Pack, but given our unique circumstances, Beta Elijah grinned cheerfully at Stella. "I've agreed to do so today. We'll take it slowly, starting with the Pack Library." Stella had already taken note of the building that housed the library on her way into the Moon River Pack the day earlier, but actually walking inside was something new. On first glance it didn't seem as modern as the one in the Silver Arrow Pack was, but it had a more rustic feel to it. The lighting was warm, with tables, chairs and plush bean bags that some pack members were sitting on and reading. At the far corner, a librarian was narrating a book to a group of enthralled and excited kids, whom laughed and cheered with each impression the woman did of the characters. Stella cracked a smile. Once upon a time, she'd wanted to be a storyteller when she grew up, and as a child she'd narrated her books to not just her brother, but to her parents. "So, what kind of books would you like to search for?" Elijah asked her. His hand was clasping hers, as he gazed at her expectantly. Having that pair of hazel eyes gaze at her with such tenderness made Stella's heart melt, and Star swoon with a soft purr. "Oh, I guess the classic literature section." Elijah smiled at her and pulled her over to the shelf in question. When Aaron and Olwen were still mates before all the things he did came to light, Stella had always been amused at how lovesick Olwen was with the future alpha. A part of her had declared she wouldn't behave the same way when or if she found her own mate. She had not expected the moon goddess to send her the man with hazel eyes, olive skin and ashen brown hair that was now holding her hand, with freckles that cemented him firmly halfway between adorable and hot. The moment their gazes locked at the east borders, with Star on her paws and howling about their mate, Stella knew that she would do anything for her beloved. Even though she still didn't know what exactly, she wasn't an expert on romance, or just interacting with people for anything other than pack matters. It had taken her a long while just to sleep the night before, and even longer not to dream of the Beta's addictive scent. If it was any consolation though, Beta Elijah seemed to reciprocate. He was patient as Stella went through the shelves of books in the classical literature section, and every time she pointed out a volume she was interested in, the next thing she knew was that said volume was in Elijah's grasp. As she casually spoke about why she enjoyed reading these books, he hung on her every word as the number of editions accumulated in his hands. There were also two more observations that Stella made. Firstly, it appeared that Elijah had been truthful when he mentioned he was a frequent visitor to the library. He knew all of the librarians there by name and had a designated table that he'd somehow managed to reserve. It was a swinging bench-type seating that faced a section of the wall that was glass, giving a good view of the scenery outside. Once Stella had picked out all the classical literature she was interested in, Elijah had them deposited at his area before assigning a librarian to watch them and bringing her to another shelf. Secondly, Elijah was incredibly open about him having found his mate. Stella was aware that some of the pack members had seen them being guided to Alpha Landon's office the day earlier, during which the beater had none too subtly held onto her throughout, but even here, his body language and the way he spoke to her implied enough to anyone who saw them. It made Stella flattered, but also somewhat self-conscious. She didn't need to zero in on any person's conversations within this building to guess that they were whispering about her. But the library date in itself was nice. Elijah himself had chosen some novels, and as they read their separate books, they made occasional and light conversation. The day before, they'd already shared the basic personal details, and Stella had dreaded that she would struggle to ask him about any other topic. Fortunately for her, their common ground in love for reading and apparently libraries helped to rectify this. It was a couple hours later, and Elijah and Stella were in the midst of an interesting discussion. Stella had been a fan of the Hunger Games books as a teenager, but hadn't really watched the films aside from the first one, while Elijah somehow had seen all the films, but never read the books. With how passionate both sides were in this, it was a miracle that they weren't shushed by any librarians and still managed to maintain an acceptable volume. "Oh, you're reading the books now that I'm here?" Stella snorted, smirking at her mate. "No putting it off anymore." "I haven't been putting it off." Elijah chuckled softly. "Okay then, I'll go find the Hunger Games books right now, and you'd better have at least finished the first book by the end of the month, capish?" "Or what?" The expression on the beater's face was devious. Stella willingly took the bait. "Or you don't get to spend time with me for the next month after." She saw the way his face comically fell. Maybe his wolf had a part to play in that, but gave him no room to argue, as she got up to go find the Hunger Games books. About 10 minutes later, Stella was striding back to the swinging bench in only to spot someone else next to Elijah and frowning. Earlier, she couldn't help feeling the slight rise in possessiveness each time any she-wolf looked at the beater, even though her common sense told her it was probably a regular occurrence due to him being the second-in-command of this pack. But now, seeing that blonde woman, whoever she was, sitting in her seat and talking to Elijah made Star growl. "Who is that? Why is she with our mate?" Stella pressed her lips together. "Don't jump to conclusions, they could be just talky." And then the blonde leaned in closer to Elijah, with a smile that could only be described as flirtatious, her sleeve brushing his arm. "Oh hell no." Purposely drawing her face up into the same smile she had used whenever she had to face Kylie in the Silver Arrow pack, Stella strode over to the two of them, dropping her pile of books none too subtly in front of the blonde. Now, as I said earlier, Stella couldn't help feeling some amount of relief upon noticing that Elijah, subtly uncomfortable, had already moved away from the overstepping she-wolf before he'd noticed she had returned. "The first Hunger Games book, by the end of the month." "Deal. Deal." Elijah grinned at her, as the blonde frowned. "Oh, I haven't seen you before. Are you the new arrivals Alpha Landon mentioned from the Silver Arrow pack?" "I'm Elise," the woman asked, smiling up at Stella. The young woman's voice sounded soft and gentle enough, but the glint in those green irises, as they sized her up said otherwise. her hand on its way to rest on Elijah's thigh, most likely as some form of claim. This was a she-wolf who knew she was pretty, and for a moment Stella faltered, every doubt she had about being the one her mate wanted rising to the surface before they were promptly shoved back by Star. Stella retained her smile and kept her voice at a similarly perfect tone that seemed friendly, but also had a hint of warning as she shook the girl's hand for the sake of appearances. "Why, hello there, Elise. It's nice to meet you. I'm Stella, Elijah's mate." The brief moment in which Elise's smile froze brought uncontrollable glee to both Stella and Star, the she-wolf's hand freezing mid-air. "Mate?" She stared at Stella with a dumbfounded look for about another millisecond before chuckling, as if the other had just said the sky was green. "You're Beta Elijah's mate." At this point, Star wanted to fasten her teeth into that infuriatingly soft and pale-looking neck of Elise's and drag her off the bench. "Star, no. She isn't worth ruining the lovely turf carpet." Fortunately, before anything could happen to damage to the library furniture and floor, Elijah interjected. "Yes, Stella is my mate." Then, to both Stella and Elise's disbelief, he lightly tugged the former into his lap, his eyes flashing his wolf's ivy green as he wrapped his arms around her waist. "My mate." The word came out as a purr as he gazed at her intensely, before he leaned in and brushed his lips against her cheek, sending sparks through her body. Stella froze as Elise's eyes became saucers, and she uttered out some unintelligible words that sounded like some kind of apology before she quickly turned and left. "I'm sorry, was that too much?" Elijah spoke into her ear, his voice low. "That was the only thing I could think of in that moment to convince her to leave us alone." Stella felt her cheeks flush with warmth. "I didn't hate it. It was unexpected, yes, but I could get used to it." The man relaxed significantly at her reply. "Good to know, but please tell me if I do anything to make you feel uncomfortable." Stella knew that others were bound to be staring, and that the way she was resting in Elijah's arms could be considered a display of public affection. But she stayed put, leaning back so that her head was on his shoulder. Right now, she and her mate were just in their own little bubble. "I will, but honestly, I don't think I'd ever be uncomfortable around you." The she-wolf chuckled, breathing in the beater's scent and exhaling with a relaxed sigh. Seemingly satisfied with this answer, Elijah nodded and retrieved the first Hunger Games book, flipping it open and reading from the very first page. Stella watched him for a few seconds before leaning over and resuming her bookmarked page in Lord of the Flies. The rest of their date went by rather smoothly. After spending half the day at the library, they went for a late lunch at a small restaurant attached to the building. Here, Stella learned that the Beta always preferred the chocolate pudding over every other dessert, while Elijah learned that Stella's favorite beverage was black coffee with no sugars. And then, a general sightseeing and shopping tour of the pack. They dropped by a music store and listened to a heap of vintage records together, recounting several childhood memories attached to each song. They also dropped by the training center where Olwen was currently practicing after her session with Delta Cassidy had finished. Stella made a promise to herself to begin her own training soon, witnessing the remarkable progress Olwen had made with her new fighting style. It suited her better. After a light dinner, the Beta legitimately kept the promise Sylvie had joked with him to fulfill, and walked his mate back to the house 15 minutes before 10 o'clock. It was here that Stella glanced at Elijah and realized he seemed quieter than before. "Was I too much yesterday?" "What do you mean?" Stella looked up at him with a puzzled expression. "I waited for my fated mate for years," Elijah stated, running a few fingers absently through Stella's dark hair as they walked. "I tried to distract myself with helping run the Moon River pack, and then with being there for the Alpha after his mate rejected him. But I always imagined how you'd look like, how we'd meet. There were so many possibilities, but I swore to myself that when I found you, I'd give you the world." His touch sent more sparks through Stella's body as her dark brown eyes met his hazel ones. "The moment my wolf scented you, the moment I laid eyes on you it was like everything had suddenly fallen into place. I thought I was in a dream. In fact, a part of me still does. My mate was in front of me, and I didn't want to let her go. His eyes then flickered away awkwardly. So I held you in my arms until Landon had to call me away after we dropped you off at the house. I am grateful he did. If he left me with you, my wolf would have taken over sooner or later and marked you. I like his wolf. Star rumbled affectionately, causing Stella to inwardly roll her eyes. What's your wolf's name? Ellis. Elijah responded with a soft smile. Yours. Star. You'll see why she's called that eventually. Ellis can't wait. Elijah grinned at her, and Stella felt Star jumping around excitedly in her mind. Neither can Star, but back to your question, no. I didn't think you were being too much yesterday. I was just. Stella breathed in softly and spoke. Did Olwen mention to you that I was originally in training to become the next beater of the Silver Arrow Pack? Yeah. Well, most of my life up until a few months ago was just that. Training. So aside from Olwen and my family, I've never really bothered to socialize with others outside of what is necessary. She admitted. She was frankly surprised at herself for spilling the beans to her mate so quickly, but at the same time, she didn't feel awkward or strange doing it. I wasn't upset that we are mates, but I'd never prepared for it. I tried not to think about it, especially after you know what happened with Olwen. So I was unused to getting that sort of attention from anyone, and I guess a part of me is scared that you might not be so happy about finding your mate the more you know me. Elijah's hazel eyes softened as he listened to the girl talk. Stella, you could never disappoint me, let me assure you of that. You know, before you arrived and we found out about our connection, Olwen mentioned you more than once. She wanted to move past her life in the Silver Arrow Pack, but every time she talked about you, she always sounded happy and wistful. She said you were her closest friend in the pack. Stella felt her heart warm at his words, and as she was any more sentimental she might have teared up. Let me ask you, Elijah cleared his throat. You could have agreed to keep Aaron and Kyla's true affairs secret, and assumed the beater position anyway since you've been working towards it your whole life. Why didn't you? That was easy. Stella shook her head vehemently as they arrived at the front door of the house once more. It wasn't right. I'd trained for a long time to be beater, but only under the right leadership. I was willing to give Kylie a chance when she suddenly replaced Olwen out of the blue, but she isn't the kind of Luna I want to work with. She and Aaron never expressed any true regret over what happened, and he turned a blind eye to anything she did wrong. And when the truth came to light, I realized that the Silver Arrow Pack wasn't what I once thought it was. So I left. She fixed her firm gaze on Elijah. When I first formally met Olwen when she began her Luna training, I swore that as ill-equipped others thought she was to take on that role, that I'd stand by her no matter what. She may no longer be my future Luna for now, but she's still my friend. A look of admiration flashed in Elijah's hazel eyes. Spoken like a true beater. He stepped closer to her, and Stella gasped as his scent overwhelmed her surroundings. Elijah gently slipped a hand beneath her chin and tilted it up. This may be too soon, but Stella, can I kiss you? The woman caught her breath, and after a moment of tense silence, she nodded, and he leaned in and gently covered her mouth with his. If sparks had already erupted in their skin from just touching each other, the kiss sent fireworks through them both, Ellis and Star both howling euphorically, and pushing both their humans on. Elijah deepened the kiss mere moments in, Stella tilting her head at a better angle, as her hand slid behind his head, and held him close. Elijah separated his lips from hers for them to catch their breath, and then dove back in and trailed kisses down Stella's neck. Stella gasped and tilted her head back, as his actions made heat bloom beneath her skin. She'd never felt anything like this. And then as his lips brushed that spot on her neck, her noises escalated into a quiet moan. A soft growl came from Elijah's throat, giving that spot some nips and a brief lick before he had to pull away, panting heavily. "Oh goddess, we have to stop before." "I get it," Stella assured him, her face just as flushed as his. Elijah chuckled and rubbed the back of his neck, trying to calm himself before his eyes flickered back to hers. "So I'll see you tomorrow." Stella nodded gently. "Yeah. Good night, Beta Elijah." "Good night, Stella." She watched the Beta head away before she went back into her home. "Evening, honey. How was your date with the Beta?" Sylvie called from her room. "Cale has been shut up in his bedroom all day, catching up with some friends from his university program apparently." Still on a high and dazed from the passionate kiss she'd shared with her mate, Stella managed to answer. "It was nice." She stumbled into the shower. One thing for sure, the week before she and her family were integrated into the Moon River Pack would be more eventful than she thought. Chapter 16 Relationship. "Then I congratulate you officially, as Sylvie, Stella and Cale Anderson of the Moon River Pack." Watching from the seats below this time, Orwen smiled brightly and applauded more enthusiastically than everyone around her for the newest additions to the pack. It was something to see Stella and her family do what she'd done a few months ago. As Alpha Landon tied the blue ribbons around each of their wrists, Stella lifted her dark brown eyes and met with Orwen's gaze. "Orwen, is this working?" Orwen couldn't help the way the smile widened on her face upon hearing her friend's voice in her head again, as she tested out her newly formed mind link with the rest of the pack. "It is. Welcome to the Moon River Pack officially, Stella." Relief and happiness flooded Stella's expression, and even Alpha Landon, who had just finished tying the blue ribbon on the girl's wrist, followed her gaze and realized what she and Orwen were doing. The smile he sent Orwen made her skin grow hot. A lot had happened in the past week. Not only had Stella, Cale and Sylvie come and seek residence, but Stella and Elijah were fated mates. Orwen hadn't witnessed every date the couple had gone on, but she was glad that things seemed to be going well, despite Stella's reservations at the beginning. Even now, Beta Elijah was standing a little off to the side on the platform where Alpha Landon and Stella and her family were on, his hazel eyes all for her as he clapped. Practically the whole pack could tell they were together. Beta Elijah had never allowed a she-wolf near him after knowing his mate wasn't from his pack originally, until the last few days since Stella's arrival. He'd held her in his arms, walked her to any place she asked, and growled at any man who dared to make a pass at the young woman. Orwen had been so preoccupied prep-talking Stella and catching up with Cale and Sylvie as well that the kiss she'd shared with Alpha Landon at the training center had almost slipped her mind. Key word almost. Anyway, maybe it was due to the fact that there were more playing Seeker, but the initiation of the 3 new wolves proved to be much more enjoyable. Orwen gladly took part in the activity as one of the hiding wolves this time round, though Sylvie's wolf Soren found her halfway into the game. This also marked the first time Elijah and Stella's wolves met, and Star made sure it was memorable by foregoing every single other wolf in the area and seeking out her mate first and foremost. Even after coming out of his hiding place, it took a while for Ellis to leave. Star had triumphantly and affectionately licked his cheek before striding away to find her second target, leaving the chestnut-brown wolf gazing at her black, almost glittery pelt in amazement. Having waited outside the area once she'd been found, Orwen was surprised to see Cobalt and Janus trotting out of the trees together. Cale rarely talked to others and even more rarely shifted in public, but he seemed to have become rather close friends with Gamma Josh if their wolves were this comfortable together. Given how Cale had been treated like an oddball in the Silver Arrow pack compared to his sister, he seemed happier here. This would be a new beginning for him as well. As Orwen walked with the Andersons back to their temporary home, their house was in the process of being set up for them to move into now that they were officially members of the Moon River Pack. Stella was talking on excitedly about how fun the initiation ceremony had surprisingly been, with Sylvie teasing her about Beta Elijah. Sylvie already had a dinner with Stella and Elijah the night before, and on the contrary to most people's fears, the pair already got along swimmingly, aside from Sylvie warning him that regardless of whether he was the beater or not, that if he ever broke her daughter's heart she would do the same to his kneecaps. As they arrived at the doorstep of the house, Alwyn hugged Stella, and was about to bid her good night when Cale spoke up. "Hey, Alwyn. Can you stay for a while? I need to talk to all of you about something." Alwyn paused, seeing the pensive expression on his face. "All right. I'm in no rush." Everyone headed into the house, and Cale waited for the other three to settle onto the couch. He pressed his lips together and clasped his hands, causing his mother and older sister to look on in concern. "You okay, sweetheart?" Sylvie voiced, her voice gentle. Cale took a deep breath, closing his eyes before turning to face them. "There's something I need to tell you all. I've been putting it off because I didn't think I would ever have to tell you, and I didn't want the way everyone back at home looked at me to get worse. But I realize that I can't keep holding this in anymore." He swallowed, allowing a moment of silence before he spoke again. "I'm bisexual." "Oh?" Sylvie was the first person to respond, not looking upset at all and instead appearing surprised and curious. "When did you realize?" "Well," Cale flushed with embarrassment. "When I was 14 and I was jealous when Amelia Fulton got the chance to kiss Evan Richards during that game of Truth or Dare in the pack house. I realized I didn't know who I was more jealous of." Understandable." Stella nodded as Alwyn cracked a smile. "I thought Evan was attractive too, until I met Elijah, of course. But anyways," Sylvie lightly interjected, pulling Cale into a hug with a warm smile. "You like both? That doesn't change a thing, you're still my son. I'm just sorry that you felt like you couldn't tell us sooner." Stella and Alwyn didn't say anything yet. Sylvie had taken all the words they wanted right of their mouth, but they joined her and enveloped the bespectacled man in a group embrace. "That brings me to my next point," Cale said, brushing his hair. "There's been a significant development that brought this on. I've found my mate in the Moon River pack as well." Sylvie gasped, her hands clasping together with excitement. "You have?" Stella exclaimed, gaping at her younger brother. "How did we miss that? Who are they?" "It's Joshua." Cale burst out, the red water rushing to his cheeks. It took everyone a few seconds to register that name. "You mean Gamma Josh?" Alwyn repeated, her mouth open with surprise. Come to think of it, she hadn't seen much of the Gamma or Cale the entire week, not until the initiation ceremony. "Yep." Cale accentuated on the P, a shy smile growing on his face. "Holy shit," Stella said, a moment before grasping her younger brother by the shoulders with an overjoyed expression. "My brother has found his mate." "Well, I saw him the first day we were here. Was that why you two were hanging around each other so much when we were waiting to be guided into the pack? Did you spend time with him yet? How is he?" "He's great." Cale smiled, his face finally lighting up as he became fully at ease at talking about his mate. "We spent some time getting to know each other, and I really like him. He actually was okay with giving me more time to reveal our relationship to you guys, but I told him I would do it tonight." "Congratulations." Stella lightly ruffled her brother's hair again. "Oh my goddess, I should have known. I am so sorry. I guess since we got here, and I met Elijah, I've just kind of been focused on that." "Nah, it's cool," Cale assured her, patting her shoulder. "I know how it is when you find your mate. I was technically doing the same thing anyway, just not as overtly as you and your mate." Stella frowned at Cale. "Is that a dig at me?" Cale eyed his sister with a knowing smirk. "I heard how you showed up Elise Ainsworth at the library through some PDA with Elijah." "Wait, you knew about that?" Stella was dumbfounded. "Elise?" Alwyn said at the same time. Cale shrugged and nodded, as Sylvie got up and went to the kitchen, saying something about making everyone some peppermint tea, while the three veered from Kale's announcement to talking about the other Omega. "Oh? Gamma Josh told me she's been aiming for Landon since they were teenagers," Kale said with a shrug. "She only stopped chasing the alpha once it was clear he was interested in Olwen, so then she tried going for the beta next." "Oh well, did he?" Stella couldn't help the uncertainty in her voice. "Not even a bit," Kale said. "I got curious and asked around a little. Both Alpha Landon and Beta Elijah have never once returned her pursuits. It's obvious to most of the pack that Elise is only after the status anyway." "Huh?" Stella responded, unsure of what to do with this new information. "You didn't tell me Elise tried to make a pass at Elijah in front of you," Olwen said. "I didn't really know she was notorious in the Moon River pack," the she-wolf said. "Anyway, she didn't take it seriously at first when I said Elijah was my mate, but the moment he confirmed I was she got all flustered and left." Olwen thought about this for a moment. On one hand, it was quite infuriating, and sort of sad to hear of the Omega pursuing men, who weren't her mate, and had consistently turned down her attempts. On the other, it appeared that Elise had stopped chasing after the Alpha when someone else was in the picture, and she backed off, as well after Elijah affirmed Stella was his mate, so at least there was credit due for not being a homewrecker, right? "You're comparing her to Kylie," Opal reminded Olwen. "The bar is on the floor." She inwardly sighed. "No matter. We don't have anything to do with Elise otherwise, and whether or not she continues to make herself trouble is entirely up to her." "Yes, why don't you go back to thinking about what to do with Landon? You haven't had some one-on-one time with him since training, if you could even call it that." "It was training." "Well, if you had half an hour more with him it wouldn't have been." Stella and Kale had again diverted the topic back to the dates Kale had gone on with Josh, and as much as she tried to listen, Olwen couldn't help wondering just what exactly she was going to bring up to Landon the next time they were alone together. Fortunately, she would not have to wait long. Hearing a knock on her door, Olwen got up from the living room, where she was already in more presentable clothes than her pajamas, thank goodness, and peered through the eye-hole. She raised her eyebrows in surprise before opening it. "Good morning, Alpha." "Good morning, Olwen." Landon nodded at her, his hands behind his back as he greeted her. "I hope your day is going well so far." "Oh, it has been only 2 hours since my day started, but yes." "Ah? Right." The man cleared his throat, looking more awkward than Olwen had ever seen him thus far. "I was hoping to talk with you a little before my weekly conference with my subordinates. We haven't really had any time together since your friend and her family arrived. Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course, but His blue eyes shot to the ground as he rubbed the back of his neck. "I thought it was about time we address what happened between us before then." "Oh?" So the Alpha was getting straight to the point. Olwen wondered if his candor was more admirable or nerve-wracking in this circumstance. "Did you mean to kiss me?" Landon asked, his voice quieting. The fact that the normally put-together and confident Alpha suddenly sounded so full of self-doubt broke Olwen's heart. "Of course," she assured him. "Ah, great," the Alpha answered, before he visibly cringed at his own answer. "Well, I enjoyed kissing you." In return, Olwen felt her face growing hot immediately. "I enjoyed kissing you too." Landon chuckled in an attempt to save himself from the atmosphere he had created. "Sorry, it's been years since I've talked to a she-wolf like this, and honestly I don't think it comes as naturally to me as other things." "It's okay," Olwen found herself saying. "I find it kind of sweet." This only made both of them even more flustered. "Do you want to take this further?" Landon finally got out after a while, the blue irises darting up to meet her eyes. I know it's only been a few months since you joined the Moon River Pack, but after we kissed, it was like I couldn't stop thinking of you, even more than before that. I figured I had to make sure we were on the same page. Even though Olwen hadn't turned him down yet, she recognized the apprehension in Landon's eyes, as if he was expecting the worst. She honestly couldn't blame him. He had assumed he and Rianne were on the same page, and was blindsided when she ran away, not too different from when Olwen discovered Aaron wasn't at all what he made himself to be. Exactly what the same as what she'd been feeling when she was psyching herself up to request to meet with the Alpha just some time ago. Yeah. I want to explore our relationship a bit more, if that's what you mean. Olwen answered softly, trying her best not to mess up her words. I want to give us a shot. She couldn't help but smile at the relief and happiness that flooded Landon's face at her reply. That's wonderful. I'm free tonight, and if you want we could go and have dinner at the Pack restaurant together. We could make it our first date. Olwen's heart skipped a beat as Opal howled victoriously and leapt around. Okay. What should I wear? To think Stella had been the one asking her that a week ago. Casual. Just be yourself, that's all I ask for. Landon assured her, beaming at her. I'll come back and walk you there at 6. Deal. All right, I'll see you later then, Olwen. I have to head to the Pack conference. Okay, see you later and good luck. This time, it was Olwen who internally cringed at herself for wishing the Alpha luck for a conference he had every week, and was most likely accustomed to. Luckily, Alpha Landon took this in stride as well, waving at her before he walked off. Olwen watched him go and then closed the door, and calmly walked to her room, flopping onto the bed with a soft sigh and a relieved smile herself. By the moon goddess, please let this date go well. So I've met your mum. Elijah spoke, holding hands with Stella as they approached the Pack bakery. I figured now it was appropriate for you to meet my parents. Stella's heart thumped nervously. She'd known on her first day here that Elijah's parents ran the bakery together, but the Beta hadn't wanted to rush things and introduce his mate to them too soon. So, she'd waited outside while he went in and brought her pastries for her to try, and apparently on the house since Mr. and Mrs. Atwood knew who their son was attempting to impress. Today, Elijah gave her hand a reassuring squeeze before they entered the bakery together, the bell at the door sounding their arrival. Mr. and Mrs. Atwood burst out from the kitchen in a soft white cloud of flour, both in aprons and grinning from ear to ear at the sight of their son holding hands with the she-wolf. You must be Stella. Hello, our son has told us all about you. Mrs. Atwood enveloped Stella in a warm embrace, the smell of pastries coming off her clothes. Stella couldn't help the smile that flew on her own face. As she returned the gesture, she had a feeling her mother and Elijah's mother would get along just fine. Hello Mrs. Atwood, it's nice to meet you finally. Oh, there's no need for that. Just call me Nicole. The woman assured her future daughter-in-law, before she winked at her son. I like her already. As Elijah's mother released her from the hug, and went to ask the Beta something about what he'd been eating recently, Mr. Atwood stretched out a hand to Stella with a welcoming smile. And you may just call me Jasper. Both Elijah and your friend Olwen have spoken fondly of you. It's nice to meet the woman herself. Stella grinned back and shook Jasper's hand. A pleasure to meet you too, Jasper. I'm surprised it took you this long to formally bring her to introduce us. Nicole lightly scolded Elijah with a smirk. You got me and my husband all excited the first day she arrived and then held her off from us for the entire week. He did? Stella asked curiously, as Jasper nodded and chuckled. You should have seen him. He barreled in here like he'd just run a marathon that night, telling us he'd met his mate. He looked like he had tried to hold the news in, but just couldn't keep it from us for very long. Stella briefly imagined Elijah doing just that and couldn't help the soft giggle that escaped her lips in return. Sounds like Elijah. A pang of sadness hit her, as she realized that she wouldn't know how Jasper and her father would feel about each other. Come to think of it, Beta Caden most likely didn't know at all what had happened to them after they'd left. Sylvie had experienced his sadness for the earlier stages of their self-imposed exile from the Silver Arrow Pack, but as the distance, both physical and emotional, grew, she slowly was able to block out those feelings. He didn't know they'd found another place to call home, and he didn't know both his children had found their mates. Did he deserve to know? Sylvie had been and was still his mate, and Stella was supposed to succeed him as Beta, but he had overlooked both their concerns because he wanted to be loyal to his alpha. And Kale, her father, never said it out loud, but he viewed his son as a disappointment. Her heart broke at his lack of understanding towards her younger brother. She couldn't tell at all what his reaction would be to his son having a male mate. Anyway, I brought something with me that will bring you up to speed regarding my son. Jasper disappeared back into the kitchen to locate a basket of food the pair had set aside for this special occasion, while Nicole sat both Elijah and Stella down at a table and produced a photo album of them and their only son growing up. Stella couldn't help but burst out laughing at the way her mate reddened at his baby photo on the cover. "Mum? My son when he was just a few months old." The woman cooed with a cheerful grin, as Elijah covered his face from the embarrassment. "Jasper had been Beta for a year or so, and we spent a long night at the hospital. Don't worry, I bet you my mum will do the exact same thing the next time you see her." Stella mind-linked her mate, who looked up at her with a small, comforted look. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode of the story, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to get notifications for updates.